everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and welcome back to Superhero Rewind Unscripted. Tonight, we're going to sit back, relax, do another list video. Instead of reviewing a movie tonight, I'm going to tell you about my favorite and least favorite, or what I feel like are sort of the best and worst superhero movie franchises. I always couch this as favorite because there's no right answer with this. It's not definitive. It's difficult to say best and worst, which is why I hesitate on that, because it kind of depends on, obviously, whether or not you objectively appreciate certain things and, subjectively appreciate certain things and dislike certain things. But it's also weird saying favorite, because there's a couple of things that I put on the best of list that are not necessarily my favorite movies, but are just things that I think work better than other things as franchises. This was a difficult exercise, and perhaps something of an exercise in futility. It's interesting that we're now at a place with superhero movies, with this milieu, that we can finally do this sort of a discussion, this sort of exercise. Superhero movies we've got such an onslaught, there's so much of it now, and the definition of franchise is constantly getting more and more confused and changing because there's so many of these things on various platforms and in various kinds of presentation that it becomes difficult to even define the word franchise, which we'll attempt to do, and I'll work under a particular definition tonight, mostly just to make this more interesting and so that we've got enough different items on our list that we can kind of play with some different things and we're not stuck with just like 10 or 11 in making a top 10 list. But it is interesting because it's 2022 now. If we did this, you've got MCU, you've got DC EU and other DC franchises, you've got the old Fox stuff, you've got lots of other kind of attempts at jumping into the superhero pond, and we're at a place now where, like I said, there's a lot of these things, and not just so many movies, but a lot of movie series. And so, first of all, let's define our terms before we get right into the lists, shall we? And before we do that, let me just say thanks a lot for watching live. Everybody that's here right now, feel free to put in your opinions as we go along. I'll read some of those as we go, and I'll interact with you as we go a little bit more often than I usually do, since this is not a review. And thanks for watching after the fact if you're doing that as well. Quick spiel for Patreon. Thanks to all of our Superhero Rewind producers for participating with the show. And if you're interested in becoming a producer and becoming a part of the inner workings of the show, you can go to patreon.com/geekvolution. The $10 tier lets you do that. You get to interact with me on Discord. You get to help vote for movies. The $5 tier does this. Pardon me, I'm sorry. It is the $10 tier now. The $5 tier helps us with the Friday show, but at the $10 tier, you get to help us decide what movies are going to be done for review. You get a lot of other input. You get your name read at the end of every show, which I'll try to remember to do, because it just occurred to me that I don't have that in my notes tonight. And you get to meet with me and the rest of the producers once a month to talk about superhero movies and the show, and sometimes even watch one. We just did a watch party a couple weeks ago for the Batman, which was a wonderful time. It was lovely, and we had, I think, 9 or 10 producers there. It was a really good time, so consider joining that if you like the show and you like what we do here. And every week, pretty much, I skipped last week. I had family in town, but most every Monday night, I'm talking about superhero movies and usually reviewing one. And I'll reveal what won the producer poll tonight, a movie from somewhere between 2017 and 2018. Ooh, what's it gonna be? I'll tell you about that at the end. It might come up or the movie might come up before you even realize I'm reviewing it next week. But yeah, make your opinions known in the comments live tonight if you are currently watching, and lots of folks already in the comments right now. And like I said, I'm going to try to interact with you as much as possible. Hayden Spring, Cap, stop streaming. I need to update my resume so I can graduate college. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for prioritizing this, but you should probably do that. I'll understand if you choose to watch this later. So lots of questions right now about the terms we'll be defining, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I mean by franchise here in a minute. And again, there are lots of different definitions. There's no right or wrong way necessarily to make this list. So when I set this up, this is not me going to be saying this is what a franchise is. I mean, technically, a franchise is an ongoing way to make money, I guess. It's under an umbrella. It's a company or a series of some kind. It's kind of a vague thing to define. And I guess it's different. The more I'm thinking about it, I guess it's different in some business than it is with like a movie franchise, right? And it feels different now because we didn't used to have so many reboots. And so when you'd remake a thing, you didn't think of it as a separate franchise or even a franchise in the first place. You just think of it as a project and then a remake of said project, right? But it's not exactly the same thing as a franchise like, say, McDonald's or Jimmy John's or something, where you have like an owner that franchises things out. It's not really the same thing. So when we say franchise, I think we mean, generally speaking, movie series that can continue, and if it spins off into other stuff, that's all part of the same said franchise. That's too limiting for what I'm doing this evening, so that's not how I'm going to define it. Hayden Spring says, is the MCU as a whole a franchise, or are you going by subseries? I'm having to go by subseries. There's no other way around it. And as I've always said, the MCU itself is a franchise, but it also has individual franchises within it. And not just because you'll get actors that play the same character whose name is in the title, or you get a team whose name is in the title and they get sequels and things, because they don't always feel like it's so weird to say this, standalone series that stand apart from all the other things that they're in. This is getting so complicated now. So you get something like the Iron Man trilogy. Okay, but does it really watch like a trilogy, even though it's numbers? Iron Man 1, 2, and 3. But in order to really appreciate Tony Stark's character arc, you also have to watch all the Avengers movies, and there's a Captain America movie in there that you also really need to see. That's very important. So it is its own franchise because of the way it's marketed, and because it is, it has that header, that marquee, I should say. Iron Man is the name of the franchise, but then it wends its way in and out of other franchises. Captain America, Avengers, Spider-Man. These are all part of the Iron Man franchise, but they're really just part of the Marvel franchise at large. But if we just said the MCU, we'd have to put it at number somewhere between 1 and 3 and move on, and then I wouldn't have enough for a whole list, probably. And these things do carve out their own tones to some degree, even though I am in the camp that complains quite a bit that the MCU has kind of, especially lately, stuck too much to a house style and a particular tone, and especially a particular story formula. But there are still kind of subtones and these kind of spaces they carve out for themselves. So no, we're not going to be talking about the MCU as just a franchise. I'm also not only counting trilogies and beyond. I thought about doing these lists that way, although I did make an alternate list of best franchises doing it that way, just to see what it would look like. But my main list, and I'll show you that, or I'll tell you about that, my main list is franchises also including just duologies, 2 movies where a third movie didn't end up happening or hasn't happened yet. I did think about ruling out franchises or series however you like it. Some of this becomes just real semantical and pointless at a certain point. But I did consider ruling out franchises that were continuing now and didn't have at least 3 movies because we maybe didn't have a good enough of a sense of them yet. But I'm not going to do that. So this is going to be a snapshot in time right now. It's possible that you'll see, in fact, I won't say it's possible, you will see at least one franchise that is not completed yet or does not have at least 3 movies, where once the next one comes out, I could change my tune later on. So right now, in this very moment, this is the list. And of course, by the end of the year, especially by the end of next year, there's every possibility of things changing around on this. I don't know that I'll ever do a follow-up to this. This is such a broad sort of idea, and I don't know how much interest there will be in this, but this was an experiment I wanted to do. I was between a couple of ideas when I initially announced this, and the other one was a much easier thing to make, but a thing where I'm going to want to play music, and I don't know if I can get away with that without getting blocked, or getting the video blocked in different regions. But I still will probably do that at some point. I was thinking about doing a top 10 intros for superhero cartoons and animated series, and that's a much more cut and dried, straightforward kind of list. And I wouldn't do worst ones. Anyway, the other thing that I've done in defining franchise here is and I've alluded to this, you can probably guess this already, each rebooted series I'm counting as its own franchise. Ergo, there are 3 Spider-Man ones. So I'm not saying the Spider-Man franchise as the whole. Where does that go on the list? That gets crazy. It's already crazy with one of these because it's and you can guess which one, in almost 20-year continuity that you'd think would be rebooted, and for a minute it felt like it was, but it all counts, so that one's really difficult to place. There's not anything else quite like that, and so Spider-Man, you've got the Raimi series, you have the Amazing series, which only had 2 films, and you have the MCU series, which currently has 3 films. So any of those has the potential to fall somewhere on the best of or the worst of list. And then Batman has 3 franchises if you don't count BVS, which that I'm having to think of as its own series of movies, even though they don't all have the same name in the title, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. And then you also have franchises that have 1 movie so far that don't have more movies, and of course I can't count those yet because I don't know what the sequels look like. So I do need to have at least a sequel before I feel like I can put one of these series on a list. I'm also going to go through a little bit later, somewhat to pad this out, because I think this will go relatively quickly, at least for me, although I'm already 13 minutes into my introduction. It's a Superhero Rewind podcast, you know what you're in for. I am also going to go through some of the franchises that didn't make either list, and try to explain why, and why it was really difficult to fit certain things in any place. We've got a $2 super chat from Edward Bador, who says, are we differentiating the Infinity Saga MCU? No, the way I'm doing this is Iron Man is a franchise. It's basically just titles, right? Iron Man's a franchise, Captain America's a franchise, Avengers is a franchise, which ends up making that wholly unfair because those are pretty much event movies, but that's kind of how it is. And so there are movies in the MCU that don't have a chance to wend their way into this particular exercise, partly because, in certain cases, because a sequel was never made, like Incredible Hulk, or because their sequels have not been made yet, like Black Panther. If Wakanda Forever was out right now and I liked it, then that would have every chance of making it on the best of list, but it's not out yet, so I can't count that. Edward Bador, Snyder trilogy. I won't say the other thing you said there, but yeah, that is what I was alluding to a little bit earlier. Sebastian Emond, just jumping around here. If you do a list of superhero cartoon intros, can you include Cyber 6's cartoon intro? I've never seen that. So I don't know. I would have to look at that ahead of time, and it's probably going to end up being things that I'm, pretty familiar with. Even if that one's great, I don't know. Alex Barron, I think this will go quickly. Famous last words. That's why I said, for me. Is everybody ready, though? Does everybody kind of understand the terms that I've laid out for this? It's completely arbitrary, but I'm trying to make it as interesting as humanly possible. And like I said, I did start this with only trilogies plus in mind, and I went, there's not quite enough to work with. I'm also only doing theatrical movies. Animated movies could count. There's not a whole lot there. There's not a ton to work with. And especially as far as franchises go, not much of things have gotten sequels yet. The Spider-Verse could wind up. It could have wound up here if the sequel was already out, but it's not. Spin-offs are a question. We'll get to that a little bit later. I've got a couple of kind of questions about the way I laid this out with that. I don't know if certain things should even count. And I'm not doing any direct-to-video stuff or direct-to-streaming movies. Again, let me also say this real quick before we get into the list. We're getting into a place where defining not just franchise but movie gets very difficult. So we think of all the, for instance, Marvel Disney Plus shows as TV shows, but some of them watch more like movies. I'm of course not thinking about any of that right now. We're just doing theatrical films, or I mean, I guess I could say in some cases movies that should be theatrical, but maybe COVID made it so that people mostly didn't see it in the theater, but I don't think any of that lines up here. There's not a ton of that anyway, but I don't know. It's just the world we live in. That sort of thing is possible now. But the definition of movie versus TV show versus miniseries, et cetera, is getting really messy now. And it's making me want to do a lot more television in general on this show. And I still want to eventually review every superhero movie ever made. And that's looking more and more impossible, but I'm trying. And the things that count as a thing that I have to do, I still think of as a film, a 2 to 3 hour, or in the case of the Snyder Cut, 4-hour film. Whether it went to the movie theater or streaming or whatever, or direct to video movies. But again, we're getting to a place where some of these like 4 to 6 hour miniseries are looking more like movies, and that kind of complicates the whole kit and caboodle. And we'll see where we're at in 4 or 5 years with all of that, particularly with MCU. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get into my top 10 best, air quote, best franchises. So my number 10 is the 90s Batman franchise, Batman 89 to Batman and Robin. And you might be thinking, okay, you've got 10 spots, and you gave one to Batman when you've never really cared that much for Batman Returns, and you lampoon Batman and Robin just like most everyone else does. What gives here? And is it just because you like 89 that much? So, Batman very nearly didn't make the list, and it was weird when it wound up there. I very seriously considered Doctor Strange, and it's got 2 movies, and like I said, there's at least one other thing on here that does have just 2 movies. But ultimately, what knocked that off the list is, so far, it's not a great franchise yet. And yes, Batman has its issues as a franchise, but I'll talk about that. It was very, very neck and neck between those two, and I'm still not sure that I'm real comfortable with what I did with this. But Doctor Strange has to kind of cheat with some things in its sequel, and there's a lot of stuff in between movies that we're missing, and it's another one of those things where Doctor Strange has a lot of adventures in Avengers movies and stuff, and Spider-Man, et cetera, in between, that makes it not feel like, and other MCU franchises have that too, but Doctor Strange, I think, has it kind of worse than anybody, where it really needed a sequel years before it got one. And so the first Doctor Strange movie I like more than I ever used to after doing the rewind on it, and that I really enjoy, in the Multiverse of Madness, at least as well, if not better. Obviously, I haven't done a rewind on that yet, but I don't know that it's good enough as a franchise, only being 2 movies so far. So the reason I went with Batman is because even though 89 and Batman Forever almost feel like they belong in separate franchises, they're both uh, really, and I don't want to say that I put it there just because they're important, but I mean, these are foundational films that you really need for the rest of superhero moviedom that I personally appreciate a lot, even though I recognize that they have a lot of flaws. And Forever, even though it kind of barely feels like it fits in the same continuity as 89, finally gave us a little bit more character dimension for Batman and made one of those about Batman, so it really improved on that franchise. And I think it's got more hits than misses compared to Superman, which is why I'll just say right now, Superman weirdly doesn't make my top 10. I'll talk a little bit more about why later on, but again, I don't know how super comfortable I am with this whole thing, but Batman Returns, as much as I've never cared for that story, and I've talked at length on Unscripted now about that movie, so I won't rehash that whole thing. I did have my best watch of that ever recently, and it has also iconic stuff just like 89 and Forever that I can't imagine the world without. So I guess, like, 3 out of 4 of those movies have really important, iconic stuff for Batman and superhero movies at large. Like, I can't imagine the world without that Batmobile. Even though I don't love Returns, I kind of can't imagine the world without that aesthetic, without that soundtrack, without Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman. So, like, some of the villain picks are enough to make me have to, with what I have to work with here. Look at what I have to work with here. Speaking of 89, with what I've got to work with, it was ultimately kind of impossible not to put that there. So it ends up being the franchise that least deserves to be here, probably as a franchise. But that's where it ends up landing. My number 9 is Blade, because it has 2 fantastic movies. The second I like better than the first, and I haven't watched those in a long time, so I can't speak to them as well as I did, back when I had to sit down and write about them. But those are really fun, thrilling movies that work as well as horror movies as they do action things, and Wesley Snipes is wonderful in both of those. The third movie is a misstep, but you're going to find that there are very few superhero movie franchises that don't have at least one giant drop off a hill movie as far as quality goes, and it's usually the third one. This is a really good opportunity to talk about that whole phenomenon, how rare it is for a third movie in a superhero movie franchise, and maybe just in movie franchises in general, to be any good at all. And sometimes whether or not the original team works on it. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but you've got, and you guys know my feelings about a lot of these things already. You've got Spider-Man 3, Sam Raimi directed it. It's the same team. It's a huge drop-off in story quality and hard to take seriously. Dark Knight Rises, in my mind, giant character motivation issues, a lot of plot points that just don't quite work out and make a lot of sense, a lot of really weird counterintuitive choices, especially based on what's going on at the end of that last movie, made by the same guy, the same team. And then when you do have franchises where the third movie is pretty good or one of the better movies in the sequence, the second movie is not that great. I don't know that this ever happens where the first movie doesn't work at all and then it all goes uphill from there. Can anybody think of an example of that? And just in general, even outside of superhero things, nothing's jumping to mind right away. But anyway, so I felt the need to put Blade at number 9, and Trinity obviously drops it down probably 2 or 3 notches from where it might have been if that movie was better and it was made by a more competent director, and if it was more tonally in line with the other 2 movies, because it just kind of runs away with itself and almost becomes self-parody. My number 8 is the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, and it has the same thing, like I was just discussing, that third movie is kind of self-parody. It's hard to take seriously. I know a lot of people like it more than I do, but I've stuck to my guns on it. I've gone back to it. I still have never really appreciated that movie. It's got sequelitis to the max in going back and retroactively changing an origin. I hate that. It's awful. I don't like anything at all about how the black suit is handled with Peter Parker. That's kind of made into a joke. I like the Venom design, and then you hardly ever get to see his face. That's just lame and unfortunate. It's got a really typical supervillain team up. And now I'm just reviewing Spider-Man 3 again. One, I have a better appreciation for than I ever have before, and I not too long ago did a Rewind Unscripted going back and revisiting that movie, and that's part of what bumps it up to even make it onto this list and get to the number 8 spot for me. 2, I don't think holds up as well as it did when it came out, but I still appreciate a lot of things about it, and I might at some point do a revisited podcast on that as well. But it's also sorry, I've just got to fix something in the comments here. I don't have any mods this evening. I should probably work on that. I should probably get some people to help me mod comments with the show. But anyway, it's another one of those things like with Batman where it's relatively early, it's somewhat prototypical, it's setting the stage for a lot of what's going to come after it. It's creating, for better or worse, a lot of what will become the superhero movie formula and set standards, both things that we should continue to look at it for and things that we should try to improve over it for. And so again, I don't want to say it's here just because it's important, but it's hard not to think of that as a factor, because sometimes with these things, the reasons they are important are why they still hold up some and work, right? These are things that innovate, I guess is the best possible word, and you don't get you don't get the superhero movie onslaught that happens in '08 forward if you don't have Spider-Man. But, if I thought the movie was terrible, I wouldn't put it here. So yeah, those 2 movies get that on the list, and then it does that, in spite of 3. Number 7 is Iron Man, and that's one of those trilogies that, like I alluded to a minute ago, weirdly has a wonderful first movie and a really solid third movie, and then the middle movie is kind of a misstep. And it doesn't work perfectly as a trilogy, because again, you do have to see some of the Avengers movies and a couple of other things in order to fully appreciate Tony Stark's character arc, particularly with 3. 1 and 2, nothing happens in between besides Incredible Hulk, because at that point, it was a simpler time, and we knew the MCU was happening, but it felt a lot more like a standard franchise, where you just get a movie, and then you get its sequel, even though there was another thing in the same continuity in between, and even though Tony Stark has an after-credit scene at the end of Incredible Hulk. But 2 is... But those movies, I should say, still watch okay as a trilogy. And you really, I said you need other movies. You really just need Avengers, right? Because, everything else that happens with Tony Stark's character is after 3. So 3 is the very next movie that happens after Avengers. It's all coming back to me now. And really, you just need to know he went to space and he had his place in the universe questioned, and he was kind of put in his place a little bit, and his narcissistic nature was stomped down on some, and that messes with his mental health and gives him kind of a PTSD thing. And so that movie's a really interesting character study, and you need it to get to all of the interesting things we do with him in Ultron and Civil War, etc., etc. I like the slattery stuff more than a lot of people, especially on repeat viewings. I think it's really fun as a spy thing. The more I've seen that movie, the more I've liked it. It's another one of those movies that I didn't really come to fully appreciate until I did a rewind on it. Number one is just foundational. It's one of the most fascinating, put together superhero movies there is. In that I'm complaining all the time about movies that don't have scripts and are made just with improvisation. And then the thing that starts the MCU was made that way, or at least partly that way, and that's why it works, and that's fascinating. It's a great movie all by itself, but you can see like how much there was to build on for a whole shared universe with that. And then the second movie is entertaining. Like, one of the reasons this is even as high as it is on this list for me is because even though that second movie used to be my least favorite movie in the MCU, and then more movies got made, and now it's probably a lot closer to center at this point. It's still not great, of course, but there's just other movies that I think work even less than that does at this point, or that I dislike more. Iron Man 2 is still a really fun piece of popcorn entertainment. It just has a villain plot that should have been finished like by the end of the first act, with Whiplash, who gets everything he wants, but for some reason keeps going. And then the other problem with it is its best action scene is in the first 20 minutes, and then the big climax is something of a letdown. And it feels too much like a commercial for the Avengers movie we're eventually going to make. But some of that feels less egregious after some other stuff that's happened since then. So it doesn't even have a terrible middle movie. It's not like Spider-Man 3 or Blade Trinity, where it goes so far off the rails that you can't even believe the same people were involved in making it, because weirdly that was Favreau making that second movie, and then it gets better in my mind anyway with the next guy, with Shane Black. But anyway, so that's why Iron Man is number 7. Number 6 at the moment is Guardians of the Galaxy, and it hasn't had its third movie yet. That could bump it up, that could knock it down. I don't know, but right now that's a solid franchise with a first movie that I gave a 4 and a second movie that I'm not sure how I'll rate it when I get to it. But that I personally, and this is one of those polarizing things that I feel like every other person you talk to has a totally different take on these movies. Guardians got a 4 from me. It's such a tightly woven narrative in my mind that does such a brilliant job of blending its comedy and its drama, and it spoke to me on a personal level, and I think it's a really good but simple character arc for its protagonist. The second movie is more of an ensemble thing. I mean, it's still very much about Peter Quill. Did I say Krill? Peter Quill. But it's got kind of more character arcs, arguably, for the rest of the characters, and it's got a really interesting villain with a personal connection to our hero, with a really good kind of internal and external conflict, and it's just bombastic and cosmic and gets grander in that way and sillier, but arguably still reined in enough for me to buy it happening within the greater context of the MCU. It's also really nice to have two movies where you don't need anything in between. The Guardians have continued to do things in Avengers movies and now in Thor Love and Thunder for like the 6 seconds they were in that movie. And so they are more interconnected with the rest of the MCU at large now, but it was kind of nice to go back and get what felt like a true sequel in a franchise. So one of the, I guess the main reason that I'm putting it at almost a halfway point is because it feels like a franchise more than maybe anything else in the MCU, even though there's only 2 movies in it so far. The 5th franchise I put here is also a franchise that only has 2 movies. That's kind of a duology, but should have another one, and that is Hellboy. And it almost didn't even make the list. I almost forgot about it because it only has 2 movies. And then I went, no, it has to be here because they're just solid. They're both really good. And I think ultimately I enjoy that second movie more than the first, but the standard of quality that Del Toro has with those movies is so consistent. And the second, like, it is a true honest to God franchise, or building a trilogy, if you like. That second movie is building wonderfully on the mythology and the character arcs that we had with the first film. Again, it's been a while since I've seen these. I'm not a huge Hellboy fan, so I can only really speak in generalities at the moment. But what I remember from them is that first movie is a fun introduction. It's not just a setup movie, but it's a fun introduction to this world. It's a decent character arc for Hellboy. The second movie has a lot of really great world building and some really cool, inventive, creative sets that remind you of the best of Star Wars. And Del Toro didn't get to make his third movie, which is a massive shame. And I'm not putting it on here as a pity choice, but it's hard to imagine that that third film wouldn't have been up to the same standard of quality, or that Del Toro wouldn't have at least given it, his all in the old college try. So if I'm including duologies, I don't know how to not put Hellboy on the list, and I think even over Guardians, those 2 movies, even though we haven't seen a third one and never will see a third one in that franchise, probably. I mean, there's no way at this point, right? But then weird things happen all the time. So I never like to say never, but wouldn't it be really bizarre, though? This is an aside. If that terrible... I didn't hate it as much as some people, but it's not good. And I'm not looking forward to eventually having to review it. But that Hellboy... see, I guess it was supposed to be a reboot, looking at the original material, but it really looks like a remake when you go back and look at what Del Toro did, because there was too much of that first movie in it compared to the comics, and you're like, why? Why couldn't we have just got that third movie? It's so irritating. But wouldn't it be really bizarre if that got made, and then it tanked, because it did, and most everybody hated it, and then we turn around and somehow give Del Toro the keys to the kingdom again, and then give him more money this time? It won't happen, but we can dream. And I know there's people for whom that is a larger dream than it is for me, even, because I'm not a big Hellboy guy. I did see a super chat that I haven't responded to, so I'm going to. Brightburns 1985 $2 super chat. Grace Randolph doesn't like Batman Begins as much. Okay. I can't really speak to that. I know who that is, but I'm not a behind the trailer guy. Is that channel? And the few videos I've seen with her, she seems to have very different opinions from me, and I'm not saying that's why I don't watch her, because I don't watch a lot of people, but I don't know where she gets to some of the things that she's at, but I haven't watched a lot of her stuff, so I don't know. Anyway, moving right along, number 4. So this was the hardest choice for me. Where in the world to put this franchise? There are some franchises that easily could have been on both of these lists, right? Batman could have been, was my number 10 on best of. It could have been very low on worst of. You could easily flip the script with that. Well, there's 2 good movies, but there's 2 really weird movies that aren't quite working also. You could flip that any direction you want to. What in the world do you do with X-Men? X-Men 1, good setup film. Good aesthetic. I like most everything about that movie, except it just doesn't get quite enough story work done. X2, one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. X3, huge disappointment. Have 105 different problems with. Was not super well directed. Is too much of a combination of stories that probably should have been 2 different movies, etc., etc. Then X-Men Origins Wolverine. Well, it's got X-Men in the title, and it has an X-Men team, kind of, so I guess we have to count it as being in the franchise, but you can also count that as being in a Wolverine franchise, because there's 3 movies. We'll talk about that later. So, does that count? Do we fit that in there too? Because it's dreadful past, like, the intro, because all the the montage with Sabretooth and Wolverine at war and stuff is cool, I guess. Okay, and then you get a soft reboot with X-Men First Class. Hey, now we're in a new franchise, and it's really quite good. And it has wonderful character arcs for both Xavier and Magneto. McAvoy and Fassbender, and is one of the most tragic friendships turned into rivalries that I've ever seen. The kind of Clark Lex Luthor thing, and it's great. Oh, but then Psych, the next movie, is going to wend it right back around to the original franchise, and it's no longer a soft reboot, and now we're going to fully mix and blend them, and it's going to be my second favorite X-Men movie, fighting for the first spot. I still can't decide if I like Days of Future Past more or less than X2. And then Apocalypse is like the Apocalypse and is one of the worst superhero movies I've ever seen, and I didn't have that until I wrote about that. That I have the opposite of in Iron Man 3 or going back to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man or something, where I hated it with a burning passion of 1,000 suns after writing about it. And then you get Dark Phoenix, which just shouldn't have been made and is easy to write off and pretend like didn't happen. So it has as many bad movies, if you count Origins, as it does good movies. But those good movies are, most of them, 3 of the 4 of them, some of the best superhero movies, and especially team movies we've ever had. So it's my number 4. I don't know how to not put it that high, even despite the really crappy ones. And it almost made number 3, but I didn't know how to put it over this next one, which is something of an obligatory choice, but the movies are all good in my mind. So what do you do? So it ended up going over X-Men. For what's in my heart and my personal loves, yeah, X-Men probably is number 3, but it's got crappy movies. It's got really crappy movies. So I felt like I had to do it. So number 3 is Avengers. Currently, we have 4 Avengers movies, and they're all polarizing to some degree, except for maybe Infinity War. I think the majority of people really appreciate most of what's in Infinity War, even if they don't like some of the other choices made with Avengers movies. But the original Avengers, I've always thought was a kind of consummate adaptation of comic to screen and gave me a comic book experience and a thing that I never thought I'd see when I was a kid. And it is, I get why people feel like it's too much Joss Whedon. I've always liked Joss Whedon, so that wasn't as hard of a pill for me to swallow. I've reviewed this movie. You guys know my feelings on it, but it's not like, it's a wonderful novelty the first time you see it, and then it does have a story that holds up pretty well, and it's a pretty good meditation on power and control and relative godhood with Loki. And then Age of Ultron is just too condensed, but I still say I like what's in it. I gave that a positive review for content, but not so much execution. And then Infinity War is definitely one of the best MCU movies in general. It's probably like Winter Soldier, Civil War, maybe Infinity War for me. I'm not sure what would get. Guardians maybe beats out Infinity War, but that movie by itself, forgetting where we go after it, and even with my issues with the way Thanos is adapted, I still think it's one of the most impressive juggling acts for a bunch of characters on screen as your protagonist, and it's a thrilling blockbuster and popcorn kind of movie. And then Endgame is deeply flawed, but so much fun, and there's still a lot that works in that movie. So yeah, it's an event film franchise, And I'm calling it a franchise because they all have Avengers in the title. There's also the argument that Civil War is sort of an Avengers movie. And if you wanted to count that, or Civil War, yes, Civil War, Captain America Civil War, that's also sort of an Avengers movie. And I get the arguments on both sides. I've always been on the camp that it probably shouldn't have Captain America in the title, but it still works as a Captain America movie. So like both of those, I'm fine with both arguments. But that would really clinch Avengers for that third spot if that also fit in there. It's just so much about that team and about the two kind of co-leaders. Okay, and then number 2, no one will be surprised, is the Dark Knight trilogy. And it goes all the way to the second spot, even with my issues and reservations with Dark Knight Rises. Somebody before the stream began, and I can't scroll up and look at it now because there's been too many comments, so pardon me for not giving you credit and revealing your name, but somebody at the beginning was like, Dark Knight Rises is a letdown compared to the other movies in the trilogy, but you look at it next to most superhero movies, and it's still above par. And I completely agree with that. That's why I gave it a 2.5 in the rewind. With all my issues with it, it's still above average. And that kind of tells you where the average is with the majority of superhero movies and how formulaic this stuff is and how not thoughtful and not thought-provoking quite a bit of it ends up being. But, I still would rather sit down and watch that over some other things. And I hate to be, blinded by nostalgia goggles now that movie is 10 years old. It's the anniversary this year, where there's a part of me that kind of wants to sit down and watch it now. Again, for the first time in a while, just because there's stuff in that movie I like, certainly, and especially production values and stuff. But I've gone over and over Begins and Dark Knight, so I won't talk too much about this, but those are such game changers, the both of them. And Begins is such a wonderful study and meditation on fear. Dark Knight, such a good meditation on anarchy, if you like, and the question of whether deep down human beings are really any different from the animals, and it's so hopeful, even though it goes to such wonderfully dark places. And those are both, and all three of them really, just wonderful theatrical experiences. But as a franchise, I mean, I don't like that Dark Knight Rises kind of forced it into a trilogy retroactively, because it never felt like it was supposed to be one. And I've never liked the 8-year gap, and that Batman has this definitive ending at the end where he doesn't get to fight very much of his rogues, and he really only goes on 3 adventures. But it's hard comparing it to nearly everything else, not to still say, yeah, but even though it's not a proper trilogy and kind of forces itself into being that, it's still so much closer than a lot of things ever get to. And so, yeah, I can't help myself. It still ends up in the number 2 spot, despite itself. And that's how flawed all of these franchises are, with the exception of my number 1, which is still flawed as a franchise for the same reason that Iron Man is, because it's part of a greater whole, a greater continuity and universe, so you do still need things in between some of these. But there are 3 movies with Captain America in the title, and they're all good. When your worst movie is Captain America First Avenger, you're doing pretty well. You're in pretty good shape. That movie has a flawed ending because there's really no good reason Steve Rogers had to wind up in the ice. And I've got issues a little bit with his relationship with Carter, but other than that, it's such a wonderful period piece, and it's a lot of fun. And I don't think the richness of the MCU is there as quickly if it's not for that movie doing so much legwork in the past. And then it just all goes uphill from there. Winter Soldier is my favorite MCU movie, and it's such a wonderfully challenging film in a lot of different ways. And then I don't want to just sit here and review it again. And then Civil War, I guess Winter Soldier and Civil War I both put on my top 10 superhero movies of the decade. Uh, Speaking of juggling acts, I mean Civil War's amazing, but the ideological argument happening between Captain America and Iron Man where I can really feel both sides, even if I might personally land on one over the other, is really impressive. I've got issues with that third act, but it certainly doesn't kill that movie. I've not reviewed that yet. I don't really know what my rating would be, but this is also, again, sort of obligatory. It's like none of the other things I've mentioned here, besides duologies, have three totally great movies that would get at least a 2.5, if not a 3. Well, and I mean, like, the Dark Knight trilogy, Rises, I gave a 2.5. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, Captain America would be the only trilogy where every movie would get at least a 3. And I'm not done Civil War yet, but it made my top 10 of the decade. It's getting at least a 3, right? I wouldn't usually come out and say that, but there's no way that gets a 2.5. I'll be shocked if I sit down and write about it and go, I guess it's not as good as I remember it. But, like, going back through these again, like Blade, it's got a bad third movie. Iron Man, it's got a not great second movie. Raimi Spider-Man, bad third movie. Hellboy and Guardians both have two good movies, but I can't put them at the number one slot. It's cheating. They don't have enough films. So that's the reason that is the number one slot, the number one answer for me. And that was easy, putting Captain America at number one. Let's see what some folks are saying in the comments. And thanks again, everybody, for hanging out with me. Hope you're enjoying this. I'll get to my worst list here in a little bit. Maybe we'll rocket through that a little bit quicker. Alex Barron, Captain America is definitely a more consistent franchise, but even Winter Soldier doesn't reach the heights of The Dark Knight or Begins, in my opinion. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, we're different people, and we can agree to disagree. I think Winter Soldier is every bit as good as Dark Knight at this point, just narratively. I would not feel that way probably if I hadn't written about it. So take that with a grain of salt. Like, just watching these things and enjoying them, sitting in your seat, I would agree with you. But just, it's Superhero Rewind. I've done the analysis. So some of this is based on it's all arbitrary, right? Some of this is based on my enjoyment. A lot of it is based on, obviously, story, and I've done the analysis on that movie, and it's every bit as good as Dark Knight in my mind. Let's see what else folks are saying. Robert Wilde, as much as I do consider Civil War a Captain America movie, Tony's tragic arc might be my favorite part of it. I really loved it. That's mine as well. Or at least that's one of the great things about it. I still don't totally buy the way he goes after Winter Soldier at the end, but I'll talk about that when I ultimately review it. Edward Bador, ultimately any top 10 list depends on whether you value quality or consistency more. Yeah, and that's why this is something of, I'm glad you said that, of a futile exercise, because you kind of have to look at both. You have to really wrestle with quality and consistency, because some of these have a really bad movie in the middle of really great franchises otherwise, and some of them have a mix of both. What do you do with that? It's tough. So real quick, I'll run down before we get to worst franchises. My alternate list, if we were only doing trilogies, because I almost did it that way, and if we'd done that, the MCU Spider-Man trilogy winds up on this list, but at the number 10 spot for me, because 2, while I enjoy it, is something of a letdown, because we don't do enough with, in furthering Peter Parker's character progression, and then I feel real funky about that last one. It's fun, but story-wise, a lot of it doesn't work at all for me. And then number 9 is Superman for trilogies. You got to keep in mind that there are only so many trilogies, so some things wind up here just because they have good movies and they're not all bad. But Superman has a great movie, and then a compromised movie, and then 2 bad movies, and a third bad movie if you count Superman Returns. So that's why that didn't make my initial top 10. And then you have Batman, uh, and Blade. Like, some of these just end up getting shifted. Iron Man is 5, and then it's the same top 4: X-Men, Avengers, Dark Knight, and Captain America. But that's what I would have done with it if it was just trilogies. Okay, let's get now into worst franchises. This gets weird because I didn't want to put anything on here, obviously, that I used for best franchises, even though you sort of could. Batman could have been number 10 for both of those. Superman could have been number 10 for this, but the first movie is too good over some other franchises. And again, if it was only trilogies, I would have had to do this differently, and you would have ended up with weird overlap. So I didn't do that. But number 10, even though the first movie is quite good, is Kick-Ass. You have 2 movies, and the second is one of the hardest things I've ever had to sit through. So just by default, it winds up at the number 10 space, because there just aren't enough overall franchises after I've already put 10 in the best of list. If I never have to see that movie again, it will be too soon. And Kick-Ass is not one of the best superhero movies ever made. I like it. I think I gave it a 3, maybe. I'm not sure. So you get, a solid movie, not a brilliant movie, and then a god-awful, horrible, no-good film. Number 9, Ant-Man. Like, the Ant-Man movies are fine, but looking at franchises, it's not good enough to make it on the best list, and it's still bad enough after that second movie was just so mediocre to me that I felt the need to put it here over some other things. And you'll understand that more when I get into the movies that didn't make either list and why. A lot of it just has to do with franchises with a great movie, or like one of my favorite things, that just had crappy movies after that. Ant-Man, the first movie, is fine. I liked it a little bit more after doing the analysis, but I also found some kind of glaring motivation issues and plot point problems. And then that second movie is just nothing to me. The whole film is about what in my mind should have been the first act plot point with rescuing Janet Pym, and I really hate that. So anyway, neither of them are bad, but it's mediocre enough it ends up weirdly as a franchise feeling not great to me. We'll see what that next one ends up doing for it. It'll probably just come off that list entirely and wind up in limbo. It'll be in the quantum verse and the Ant-Man movies. Okay. My number 8 is really weird because it kind of depends on how, again, you define terms. My number 8 is Suicide Squad. The Suicide Squad is a good movie. I don't think it's a great movie. I don't love it. It's not my thing, and I found the first hour really difficult to get through. And then by the end of the second half, I enjoyed it, and I haven't watched it again. But the first Suicide Squad movie is terrible and one of the most poorly edited things I've ever seen. So again, just with the limitation of franchises I can pull from, I felt the need to put that here. If Birds of Prey counts as part of a trilogy, because I mean it's a spin-off, but it's Harley Quinn, and these movies are sort of about her, at least somewhat. If I could sneak that in there, then I really get away with putting that on this list, and probably higher. But I didn't do that. I was just looking at Suicide Squad and The Suicide Squad. So even though The Suicide Squad is pretty good, Suicide Squad holds it back far enough that I have to put it here. And you can say, well, but Cap, it's a soft reboot. Yeah, but only soft. The Suicide Squad is sort of a sequel to that movie. So I'm counting and I'm putting it here. The worst of list was hard to put together. Number 7 is Amazing Spider-Man. That first movie is good, but flawed. And again, keep in mind, being the worst of doesn't mean every movie in the franchise is bad, because it's hard to get franchises where every movie is bad. If they were, then they wouldn't be as likely to get sequels. Now, sometimes bad movies do get sequels, and we'll see that on this, but they don't tend to get trilogies. So anyway, and also, some people think things are bad and other people don't, but then if it's polarizing enough, it's not going to do well enough at the box office to keep continuing. Amazing 2, I don't think is as bad as a lot of people do, but I get, it just gets so out there and bombastic, and it's super convoluted, and it makes sense that it didn't end up with a third movie, and that makes the list partly just because how do you fail so hard you can't get at least a trilogy out of Spider-Man movies? But even that first movie, again, pretty flawed, even though I really like the origin in it. It is based on too many coincidences in the first place, and then the villain plot gets really silly by the end. Okay, number 6 is Thor. I think we can just move on from that. No, I'll break it down very briefly. Thor would make this list even if Ragnarok and Love and Thunder didn't get made, because it's just not a great franchise. It keeps kind of starting and stopping. It can't decide what it wants to be. That first movie wasn't allowed to get into the Asgardian politics and mythology enough. Too much of it takes place on Earth. Hemsworth's performance is really good, but it's way too formulaic. It doesn't utilize its director properly, and that second movie is dull as bricks. And I think one time I've made it through that movie without falling asleep, and it was for the rewind. No, another time because I had to do a commentary on it. But I mean, I barely didn't make it even for that. And then Ragnarok, I don't like, and it takes a step off a cliff into Goofy Town and becomes self-parody, but in an entertaining way that a lot of people liked that I just didn't care for. Even if you love that movie, it doesn't make it a good franchise, right? And then Love and Thunder does even more of that, even though in weird ways I think that movie story-wise is maybe kind of better than Ragnarok, but it's not a better experience overall. They're about on par for me. Anyway, so that's where I'm at with Thor. I've got a super chat from Sebastian Eamon that says, question, Cap, if Superman 3 had been rewritten to have Brainiac instead of Richard Pryor's supercomputer, thoughts on late Yul Brynner in casting? I've never heard that as a possible pitch. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's probably several guys at that point that could have played that role. I've never given that any thought. I don't know. I could see it. That certainly could have worked. It's a neat idea. Certainly somebody that looks good bald. I mean, at the very least, like I could kind of see it with the makeup and everything. Number 5, Man of Steel, BVS, Justice League. I have to consider that a franchise in and of itself. It's the movies that Snyder made, even though they don't all have the same title. And it's the only thing like this in superhero movies, and certainly on this list. So I thought about axing it and not even using it because of that, but I think I have to think about it as franchises. Now, if later on Henry Cavill gets another Superman movie, then it gets really wonky in how we would consider that a series or a franchise. But BVS is very much Man of Steel 2. It's got so much of the same soundtrack. It's got so much of the same tone, even though it gets a lot more stylistic, but especially on the Superman side, it's a Man of Steel sequel. And then Justice League does feel like, especially the Snyder Cut, another film in that series. And if you don't like that idea, those as a trilogy, you don't think it should count that way, just remember that BVS is setting up the Justice League really hard and has the word justice in it. So, I mean, there's connections with all of them, right? Man of Steel means Superman. Superman's name is in the next movie and is building directly on collateral damage and stuff that happens in Man of Steel. And then Justice League is taking the characters that were established, Wonder Woman and the rest of the Justice League, and then doing a story with them. So it's a trilogy, and I've talked a lot about what doesn't work about Snyder, but it's also kind of a bad trilogy or kind of a bad franchise because it has to keep kind of starting over in weird ways. Man of Steel is a better movie and makes more sense than BVS. It's still kind of tonally wonky and convoluted in some of its storytelling, but BVS is an unadulterated mess and makes no sense. And I spent 5 hours talking about that. That whole thing broke me. It's I'm jokingly going to say it's the reason I don't script these anymore. And then Justice League is this massive mess where there's 2 completely different versions of them. One is totally compromised and everything is missing. the Whedon version, and it's just not a good experience. And then the other one is much better, but 4 hours long, and needs to be cut down to like an hour 45 somehow. So anyway, can't help but include that as my number 5. And then number 4, so far, I'm putting this even over those movies, you guys, is Venom. I just don't like the take. Like, there's fun stuff with that first movie. I think Carnage is Let There Be Carnage is abysmal. It's really bad as an adaptation. I found it no fun at all. I've only seen it once. I'm avoiding it like the plague until I'm forced to watch it again. So these are my feelings right now. Once I'm writing about it, maybe things will change a little bit, and I would move this some. But it's just where I'm at with it now. It's consistent. I mean, in that way, I guess. Again, consistency versus quality, right? I really like that comment from earlier. I could move it up just because it is consistent in its tone, but it's got that problem of doing too much of what the first movie was doing again. It kind of already had a Carnage-like character, and then it just does another bad symbiote, but his name is Carnage, and he's real generic compared to the original Cletus Cassidy and Carnage. It doesn't... I want to say it doesn't understand that character, or if it does, it's not interested in giving us what's fun and scary about Carnage on screen. I like almost nothing that's in that movie, and like, again, Venom, the first movie, there's fun stuff in it. I don't hate it, but once you put Let There Be Carnage in there, I almost can't help but put it on the list just because, like, this is totally subjective. I just don't want it to exist. I hate it as a franchise. I hate it as being apart from Spider-Man, having nothing to do with that, and then being this kind of weird, dark comedy thing that I think, especially at this point, is not working at all. Can't help myself. That's where I'm at with it. Number 3, this should... I don't like my order with this the more I'm looking at it. I think maybe... this could go up a couple of notches, but number 3, I included Fantastic Four, being the only 2 movies in an ongoing continuity we've ever had, because it didn't get a third one. The first movie was not unsalvageable, and I could see why you would make a sequel to it. It's just too much of a sitcom. There's really, I like most of the casting except for Alba. It's just kind of a movie where, I've always said this, but the characters get their powers, and then they spend the rest of their movie doing stuff with powers. Having powers. That's kind of it. And then the clock is ticking, and we get to a point where, I guess we need a third act now. And then they fight the bad guy, and then they win in like 5 minutes. And that's it. That's all you get. Read a book. So I don't hate that movie, but it's not really a movie. And then... your second movie is just super weak, again, in the adaptation department, where you make Galactus a giant cloud, and you have a Silver Surfer that's fine, but can't save the movie. And the chase sequence with him and Torch is cool, but that's about all it's really got going for it. The relationship stuff with Reed and Sue is so much worse than even in the first movie. Somehow wouldn't have thought that was possible. And it's, I don't know. It just ultimately didn't warrant any more, and it weirdly peters out, even though that first movie is nothing but setup. I think that's why I can't help but put it on the list, but it's probably too high on the list. Number 2 is The Mask, because it's a franchise and shouldn't be. So you have one of my favorite superhero movies of all time, The Mask. You might think, well, because of that, it shouldn't be this high on the list, but it's a great standalone movie. It's not a franchise. You could have made a case for that, but then Son of the Mask just goes, we have to have a obligatory sequel. We know people will look at it just because of brand recognition, title recognition, and it's more than dreadful. It's hard to even describe. I think there's a whole part in my rewind where I'm just, and that's scripted, where I'm beside myself to the point where I'm just kind of making noises because it melted my brain. So yeah, just... it sucks that that's a franchise after that movie. Couldn't help but put it on the list. Again, you've only got so much to work with. And then number 1, and again, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but what I placed for my number 1 is Ninja Turtles 2014, because it's just not the right start for a franchise in the first place, and then it got a sequel that was somehow worse, and it's hard to imagine that being possible. Where you've got uh, this very bizarre hodgepodge thing where it can't decide exactly who it's for. It's kind of trying to make the '87 cartoon updated and a little more serious, but it's got turtles that are too large and you don't buy them as ninjas, so it's hard to take it serious in the first place. When the best thing your movie has going for it is that actress playing April O'Neil, you're in trouble. Like, she almost saves it for what it is. That's how weak the whole thing is. I don't know why I can't think of her name right now. We all know who I'm talking about. And then that second movie is just kind of painful. And Bebop and Rocksteady are fun, but that's about all it's got going for it. So just, I don't know, the whole idea of that didn't work. And I haven't reviewed that second movie on Rewind. I might do that in the not too distant future, or put it on a poll, and no one will vote for it because nobody probably wants to hear me have to prattle on about that. But that top 5 could have gone anywhere. I feel like worst list was actually kind of harder than best. It seemed more arbitrary as far as where things go. Megan Fox, thank you. Where things go on the list. This is probably the most different movies I've ever had to talk about at one time, and it's kind of fun trying to keep everything straight in my head. Anyway, okay, so I thought about making an alternate worst list that would, just like with my alternate best list, just be trilogies, but the problem was some of the trilogies plus, where like you've got 3 movies, but then some things even have 4. I had not seen all of the movies in all of the trilogies was the problem. We're still in a place where I've not seen all of these things. And so trilogies that could have made the list if I was only doing trilogies. One I have seen all of would be Unbreakable, Split, and Glass. And even with as much as I hate Glass, I didn't have the heart to put it there instead of Kick-Ass, because Unbreakable is wonderful, and I think I gave a 4 in the Rewind, and Split I like more as a standalone thriller, even if the premise is pretty out there, is pretty unbelievable, kind of hackneyed. But it has a really fun surprise connection to a franchise at the end. That doesn't make the whole movie great, but it's just a real fun backdoor spin-off. And then Glass is hilariously bad. But anyway, so that would have been there if I had only been doing trilogies, but I've not seen RoboCop 3, so I couldn't include that, and the first RoboCop is so good that you end up being in a Superman-Batman situation with that. Ninja Turtles is the same way. The first movie is wonderful, and then 2 is a step down, but still fun, and then 3 is abysmal, but 2 is not bad enough for it to inch out anything on that list, even twofers. And then The Crow, I've not seen anything past City of Angels. Darkman, I've never seen either of the sequels, Return of Durant or Die, Darkman, Die. I'll eventually review those, but I know what they are, but I've not seen them. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about franchises that didn't rank. We already brought up Ninja Turtles, and that's the main reason that doesn't make the worst of lists. Is the first movie is too good, and the second movie is not horrible. It's really silly, and it's not what you wanted from a sequel, but boy, is it quotable, and I still go back to it. It's a lot of fun. I'd already talked about why Superman isn't there, and Superman I had a hard time putting on either list, because it's got a great, it's got one of the best superhero movies of all time, of course, and if Donner had got to make his Superman 2, it probably ends up in at least the 9th or the 10th, if not the 9th spot, even with 3 and 4, if somehow those had come out exactly the same way. But even with the Donner cut, it's not a true version of that movie. It's fun to watch. I'm glad we have it. I'm glad we got to see those scenes, but it's not a true Superman 2. It has to use the same ending from the first movie, and so you have to imagine the first movie happening differently, which is really weird. And so I do go back to it, but I also go back to the Lester version too. There's a lot of people that say, "Oh, I'll only watch the Richard Donner version of that movie," and I'm like, so what do you do if you want to have, maybe you just don't do this. What do you do if you want to have a double feature of those movies? You watch the Earth get spun backwards twice. It's weird. And then the nonsensical nature of Clark, just because you don't have any other footage, Clark walks back into the diner at the end of Superman 2 and beats up a guy that never actually did anything to him because he turned the Earth backwards. Leave that out. It doesn't make any sense. All right. So then Chewbacca's Lover has a $5 super chat and says, the consensus on Bay Turtles seems to be better than we thought they would be, but still sucked. That's essentially what everyone was saying back then. Yeah, especially with that first movie. It's just awkward. This is everything about that whole thing is really strange and awkward. I still want to see the alternate reality where they just made the movie that they almost did before they let the cat out of the bag that it was going to be aliens instead of, pardon me, instead of mutant ooze hitting Earth turtles. Because it at least wouldn't have been a compromised vision. I wish they just made the movie they wanted to make. It probably would have still been bad, but it might have been more interesting. Okay, Deadpool is a franchise with a great first movie in my mind and a mediocre second movie. The more I see that, the more disappointed I am with it. It's still got a lot of fun stuff. It's still really enjoyable to watch. I just think that there's a lot of missteps in the plotting. I really don't like what's done with Vanessa in bringing her back in the credits. By the way, I'm spoiling anything I've ever seen that I'm talking about here, so my apologies if any of this somebody is listening to this and hasn't seen before. But I've not done the rewind on that, and that one I've been staving off because I have to watch 3 different cuts, and that's going to be a bit of a project. I'm going to need at least a couple of weeks to work on that one, probably. But the best cut of that has yet to be made. I've said that before, and they're consistent, I guess, in humor, but I don't think that second movie, and there's a lot of ambition in that second movie, and there's a lot that works about it, but ultimately I just don't think it's as tight and anything like as good as that first movie, and I almost wish that it had somehow, and I have this with a lot of stuff, somehow it could have been made without the creators, the directors and producers, the writers, having any idea how the first movie was perceived, because I think that did affect it, and how could it not? Senior Sticks, Cat Pennyworth on HBO Max Season 3. Yes, maybe. In my watching and reviewing. It's so weird that people are talking about that now. Nobody talked about the first 2 seasons. I hardly ever heard anything about that. And now it gets this silly subtitle. I'll just mention this real quick because it's in a super chat. Oh my god, I can't even believe they did this. Like this would get people to watch it now. But maybe it is, because suddenly I'm hearing people talking about it. The origin of Bruce Wayne's butler. Like, people that are talking about that right now, did you watch the first 2 seasons? I've seen the first 3 episodes. It's okay. I have no interest in seeing any more of that at all. I did look at the trailer out of morbid curiosity because of the silliness of that subtitle. It's a really horribly edited trailer with really generic looking inner titles, just like the Batwoman Season 3 trailer had. But anyway, yeah, I don't really have any intention on watching that anytime soon. Anything is up for grabs potentially on future rewinds as far as TV goes, if I can get my ducks in a row and find the time to watch stuff so that I can more regularly do seasons of TV. I want to make more of that happen because there's so much of it, and again, because the lines are just getting blurred so hard, and because there is as much interest sometimes in TV stuff as there is movie stuff, both from fans and what people want to see me talk about. So never say never about anything, but I kind of need to figure out maybe a somewhat different format for those, just to make it make sense that I'm watching that much TV and trying to somehow get notes together to do a show. Edward Bador, $2 super chat. Cap, we need to talk about Mask and Legend of Zorro. That is on this list. Thanks for mentioning it. Yeah, I've never seen Legend of Zorro, which is probably why that's not on the worst of list, because I've heard horrible things about it. Oh, it's another one of those things where it's like, is Legend of Zorro bad enough to put a franchise with something as great as Mask of Zorro? Did I say Legend first? I meant to. As Mask of Zorro on the worst of list, like I did with Mask, with Son of the Mask. I don't know because I've not seen it, but I've heard it's one of the worst things ever. And I guess Orsi and Kurtzman made it. Somebody told me that on a stream the other day, and I didn't realize that. So yeah, you say we need to talk about it. I've never seen it. I will eventually have to do a rewind on it because it counts. I guess I've got to do all the Zorro movies if I'm doing every superhero movie ever made, which means I'm going to end up reviewing some things that nobody will care about, and they'll get like 15 views. But for the sake of completion, I will eventually at some point do it. And that will probably end up being the first silent film I've ever done. And I've seen that movie, and it's really, really good. Anyway, I'm taking too long with these. Other franchises that don't rank, Wonder Woman. Love that first movie. The second movie is very bizarre, and I don't really care for it. It's real middle of the road to not good. I've, of course, not done a rewind on that yet either, but the first movie is still good enough. I couldn't bring myself to put it on the worst of list, but it can't make the best of because and especially as a franchise, because Wonder Woman 1984 is just a totally different thing and does not successfully navigate those waters the way Captain America did in being arguably 3 movies in different genres that create a really wonderful trilogy for Captain America, despite the fact that he also is in Avengers movies and some of his character stuff is there. MCU Spider-Man, except for my alternate list, doesn't make it because Homecoming is probably still my favorite Spider-Man movie, and then it kind of all goes downhill from there for me. And I don't think either of those other 2 movies are bad, or at least terrible. I still don't know if I want to call that third movie bad, at least story-wise, yet. I need to give it the rewind treatment before I totally come down on it, but I couldn't put it on the best or worst of list because of that. Okay, Wolverine is fascinating. In some way, I almost could have included Wolverine as the worst franchise, not in having the worst movies, but just in being a franchise, where, like, maybe I should have done that. Maybe Wolverine should have gotten the number 1 spot. The reason it didn't land anywhere is because it's hardly a franchise, right? You have X-Men Origins Wolverine, which has X-Men in the title, which anchors it into the X-Men franchise, and Wolverine is the central player in the movie, but he kind of was that already anyway. And then you get The Wolverine, which is not at all a sequel to that movie, and it's hard to say if it's even in the same continuity. It's hard to say if X-Men Origins even counts at all anymore, but it's hard to say if The Wolverine is really in continuity with much else. And then Logan is made by the same guy, but not really a sequel to The Wolverine, and it's hard to say if that's in continuity with The Wolverine. It's really strange. The Wolverine is a solid movie. Logan is a masterpiece in my mind, and X-Men Origins is one of the worst things ever. So it's inconsistent in every possible way. You have terrible, fine, friggin' great. I say fine. I think I gave the Wolverine a 4 in the rewind, and I've kind of, or maybe a 3.5, I can't remember, but I've kind of wrestled with that ever since. I had an experience with that the last time I talked about it, but I think I might have been a little bit hyperbolic with it. I'm not sure it's quite as good as what I was saying in that rewind, but like, it feels like 3 totally different continuities, and it's 3 completely different qualities of movies, even though 2 of them are made by the same guy. It's very strange. We talked about Deadpool. Daredevil and Elektra is weird, because Elektra is a spin-off. It's not a sequel, but it's kind of a franchise. It's pretty clear why that didn't land anywhere. Doctor Strange we talked about. RoboCop, Crow, Darkman, we talked about that. And then Incredibles is the only animated thing I would have considered, because we don't have more movies for Spider-Verse yet. And Incredibles is a masterpiece, and the second movie is there. It's fine. So, not a great franchise, but not bad enough to put anywhere. Franchises that aren't actually series in a continuity. So these are things I couldn't have put anywhere just because of the terms that we set up. You needed 2 movies at least that are in the same continuity. Power Rangers has 3 movies. None of them is in continuity with the other 2. It's a lot like Wolverine. Except Wolverine is more arguable. That's just a big question mark. We know the 1995 movie for Power Rangers is not in continuity with the TV show or anything else. We know that Turbo is basically a big screen pilot for the Turbo TV show, which is in continuity with all of that. And Power Rangers 2017 is an attempted reboot for teenagers and adults. So it's all 3 totally different things. Punisher has 3 different movies. And a TV show now. 3 different movies that are all in totally different continuities. Warzone is maybe a soft reboot. You could make the argument it could be in the same continuity, but it doesn't feel like it. And the other Fantastic Four movies, of course, don't have anything to do with the aforementioned one or each other. Finally, let me actually read the super chat real quick, and then I will go down this last list of a few things, and then we'll be all finished for the evening. Bob the Hun, $2 super chat. Alien Thing. I'm just gonna read this because I don't really know what he's saying. Oh! Alien Thing was supposed to be a lie, or so Bay claims. He means for the Ninja Turtles movies. It seemed like there was pretty clear proof of that. It's been too long, but what I remember is that it was either, well, maybe it was leaked. I was going to say, I thought of their own accord, they were talking about that and saying, hey, they're aliens this time, and there was all this backlash. Maybe that's not what happened. Maybe it was just a leak. Or maybe the idea, if that's true, what he's probably saying is that there was a misunderstanding that the ooze came from space, but not the turtles, which is a thing that we do in Turtles and stuff. So maybe that's what happened, but it's kind of, I never heard it that way, so I don't know, but it's been too long since I've read about this stuff or even thought about it. Let me make sure that there's nothing else here that I need to... Bob the Hun says perverts in the chat. Yes, that's why I need, and sorry about that, I am getting rid of them right now, and they're just bots, and that's why I should probably try to get a moderator or 2 for the comments for the show. Robert Wild, $2 super chat. What about Lego Movie or Lego Batman including Lego movies? That's interesting. I didn't think about that. The Lego Movie is not really a superhero movie, which is why it just didn't compute. By the way, if there are any other franchises you think of that I missed, feel free to mention them in the comments, and I'll weigh in on them. I tried to write down everything I could, which is why I'm going through the franchises that I didn't list. I don't usually do that with list videos, but there's few enough of them. I knew there'd be a lot of questions of, like, why didn't you... This one's bad, why didn't... Or enough of the movies are bad, why didn't you put that there? Enough of the movies are good, why didn't you put that there? So I thought we could run through all of the ones that I thought of. But yeah, just looking at lists online and looking at my superhero movie shelf, I tried to include everything I could think of, but there could be something I'm missing, especially anything kind of obscure. So yeah, if the Lego Movie counts as, and I've thought about reviewing the Lego Movie as a superhero movie, because Batman is in it, a version of Batman is there, and there are, super heroic things that happen in it. You could make the argument, or at least, and I've done this with things where I've sort of cheated. Like, this is not exactly a superhero movie, but it can be reviewed that way. I did that with Sin City, and maybe a couple of other things. We had the whole discussion a few weeks ago about whether Donnie Darko counts, and because enough people think it does, I decided to do it on Rewind, even though I'm on the fence about it. But thanks for mentioning that, Robert. Sebastian Eamon just put in a $1 Canadian super chat with no question. Thank you for that. Yes, Smarty Pants Tutoring, there are 3 Power Rangers movies. There's the 1995 Power Rangers movie. It's called Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. And then there's Turbo, a Power Rangers movie, which is neither a movie nor is it really a Power Rangers thing, because they hardly ever morph. And then there is the 2017 Power Rangers movie, which is just called Power Rangers, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 2014 was almost just called Ninja Turtles. Are we all caught up? Okay. Movies that might have made the list had they gotten sequels. Hard to say because you don't know what the sequels would look like, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a few things that it's weird we never saw sequels, or it would have been nice to see them, and it probably would have shook things up quite a bit. I like The Shadow from the 90s. it sucks that didn't perform. I feel the same way about The Rocketeer. Those are franchises. Were they franchises I could totally see showing up here? Or they could have crashed and burned in sequels, who knows? Superman Returns is interesting because that is sort of a soft reboot. It wants to be in the Donner continuity, the Reeve continuity, but it also wanted to be more comic book. And there were really interesting things bandied about a sequel to that if it performed better. And it's possible that second movie would have been good enough to, improve on that material and, end up making me like that as a franchise more, and it could have shown up on the list. Chronicle's weird. I love that movie. It stands alone great. I don't need a sequel to that. A sequel almost happened. Trank had a script, I think, and if it did, it would just be interesting to know if it was any good, and that could have thrown that as a franchise on a list. Big Hero 6 is another movie that I'm not a huge fan of, but loved narratively when I finally wrote about it, and if it had a sequel that was anything like as good, at least story-wise, as that first movie, I know it got a TV show, and that's apparently why they didn't, I guess 2 now, because I think Baymax is getting his own show, but that's, I guess, why they didn't make movies, but if they did, it's possible, I guess, that could have been the animated thing on this list. Hulk 2003 is a baffling movie. Again, kind of a flawed thing, especially by the third act, but such a good meditation on mental health. And it's such a moody movie, and I think that actor was a really good pick. And if it had made a franchise, it was not anything like unsalvageable, and it could have had great sequels and could have wound up on this list. Of the 3 Punisher movies that were made, '04 is the one I would have liked to have seen a sequel to. I think a lot of people feel that way. I think that is a pretty solid movie, even if it's not really my thing. I like it a lot more now than I used to, when some of the violence that's in that movie was harder for me to take. And just based on Dirty Laundry, the little fan film with that actor, what's his name? Somebody will tell me. It's on the tip of my tongue. There could have been a great franchise there as well. Constantine, I think there's still talk about a sequel happening to that. I like that first movie quite a bit, even though I've got issues with some of the execution, and I think that's another thing that if it had a great sequel, could wind up on the list. Daredevil wasn't unsalvageable. It could have had a much better sequel. So if you took the director's cut as canon, and then you made a better movie that actually went to the theater without being compromised, possible. Not likely, but possible. Power Rangers 2017 was not unsalvageable. You could have made a much better sequel to that. I liked that cast fine. Could that have wound up on the list? Probably not, but it's possible. And this one actually is a lot more plausible. TMNT from 2007, the animated movie that felt kind of soft rebooty. It felt like it sort of kind of could have been in the movie, in the live action movie verse, but was sort of its own thing and felt more like the 2003 series than it did anything, especially with the way Casey and April are handled, and April being basically just a ninja with no explanation. That could have had great sequels, and it's kind of too bad that those weren't made. Chewbacca's Lover, another super chat. Thanks so much, $5 super chat. I liked Superman Returns as a kid, even though nobody else did. What it did with the continuity was really unusual. Everything happened, but later. Yeah, it was. It's also really weird to cast really young actors to play characters in a decades later sequel, to be like, Superman's finally coming back. I mean, he looks like he's 24 years old, but he's in with Lois Lane that also looks like she's 24 years old, but with all of this continuity that's happened in the past. I mean, I guess it's just the first 2 movies. They sort of did that Halloween thing where they're like, this counts, but this doesn't. But you still would think you'd cast slightly older. It's very strange. And then you go, let's have a Lex Luthor that looks like the one from the page, that acts more like comic book Lex Luthor and is a little bit more like a corporate tycoon type. But we'll give him the dialogue from the Gene Hackman version and give him a villain plot that's just like that, but sort of in between. I don't know. Oh yeah, and let's just have a bunch of stuff in a helicopter. That's really boring. I think Chewbacca's Lover, a lot of people had maybe nostalgia goggles on with that movie, or were just thrilled by what is legitimately thrilling in the movie theater with that movie. I didn't talk to anybody when that came out that didn't like it. And I liked it a lot when I first saw it. And it's only when I thought more about it and broke it down and saw it at home that the whole thing fell apart. And it was an early example of ride real hard on nostalgia, although not in a cynical way. I think Bryan Singer was just too close to the material in that he loved the Donner stuff and didn't want to tell a story so much as write Donner a love letter. You can tell that with his video journals in the behind the scenes stuff in the features on the disc. And there's a trick that I don't think it does it on purpose, but there's a trick that some other things later have tried to pull on purpose in a more cynical way, like Star Trek 09. This is a thing for people that have that the original is close to their heart and a big part of their childhood and they love, but they haven't taken the time to really go back and study it again in a long time. If you haven't seen Donner's Superman or Superman 2 in a long time and you watched Superman Returns, it could blindside you in making you feel some of the things that made you feel. But if you watch those again, you'll go, no, wait a minute, I've heard 70% of this dialogue before. When before, you might go, some of this is familiar, but that's part of what's kind of tugging on my heartstrings with it. And I think that's what a lot of us felt. It is a really cinematic movie. Absolutely. And I think that's why a lot of us enjoyed that in the first place. I think it cheated, or not cheated, but I think it managed to, pardon me, what's the word I'm looking for? I think it managed to just kind of dupe a lot of us into the theater, into thinking it was a better movie than it was. Okay. I have one more little list that I forgot about. Franchises that might make this list later, because we've got several things right now, of course, because we're making superhero movies all the time, that have one movie right now and are franchises, but we haven't seen the sequels to, so I couldn't use them. Black Panther, I talked about earlier. Of course, there's every possibility Wakanda Forever is really good, and I put Black Panther on my top 10 of the decade. It's obviously a shame that we've lost Chadwick Boseman, and that second movie is maybe something of an uphill battle, and I hope it isn't just... I hope that whole experience isn't just about kind of... I'm sorry, I've been talking a long time. I'm trying to get my thoughts together here. Just a tribute to the actor and the character. I hope it doesn't fall in that Ghostbusters Afterlife trap, but it could make that. The Batman, obviously, Spider-Verse. Aquaman, not as likely. That movie is a mess and a mixed bag. I like a lot of things in it, but it feels like it should be... It feels like a trilogy forced into one movie, and it's silly. Shazam, again... I like that first movie fine, but I would be shocked if I like the sequel enough to put it on the top 10 franchises. And Joker, who knows? So, anyway, those are all of my notes. Bob the Hun, $5 super chat. The popsicle scene. Sebastian Eamon, Megamind. I almost put that on a list of things that, if it had sequels, could have made the list. But it stands alone so well, I don't know that I needed more of that. But I did consider putting that on the list. Anyway, Bob the Hun, $5 super chat. The popsicle scene from the 2004 Punisher was lifted from a 90s Punisher issue by Chuck Dixon. He mentions it in his podcast. It's line for line. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. That scene is messed up. But yeah, I didn't know that came from comics. Thanks for telling me that. That's really interesting. I didn't even realize Dixon had a run on Punisher. Okay, well, last call for questions, comments, super chats. I will go ahead and reveal here in a second our movie for next week. I am going to review something, and I put out a poll for more kind of heavy hitter movies that I haven't dealt with yet from a few years ago, 2017, 2018. Obviously, we're not doing Tweetling previews tonight because we don't have any reviews. I'm going to go ahead and say thanks to all the patrons Everybody bear with me because I forgot to pull this up. But as always, first of all, just thank you very much to all the patrons at every tier for the support. Whatever you have been doing is wonderful. Really appreciate you. And obviously, I appreciate you guys just for watching, just for being here. But I especially want to say thanks to all of our Superhero Rewind producers. Once again, that's at the $10 tier, and one of the several perks that you get now for being a producer is, I'm going to say thanks to you individually at the end of the show, and that's at the $10 and above tier. We also have a $15 tier for requests, and you are a producer for that as well. So thanks so much so I'm going to read these down, and then I will reveal our movie for next time and read any more comments that happen to come in. Zach, Wendell Jones, Thorne Jones, and Nathan Jones. None of these three guys are related, I don't think. Miguel Rodriguez, Michael Gulick, Matthew Brody, Kareem Roberts. These aren't in alphabetical order either, so I don't know why those three guys wind up together, but they do. Jacob Schneider, Damon Begay, Checkers the Inventor, Adam March, Thomas Edgehill, The Day Ghost. Thanks, Austin. Super Billy, Stone Gassman, Michael Martin, Matt Bat 68, Joshua Gulisano, Jajira, Joe Turner, Hot Soup, Goofster 123, Elliot Slater, David Crabtree, Chewbacca's Lover there in the comments tonight, and Blake. Thank you guys so much for being producers, and once again, $10 tier gets you access to the Discord, and you get to hang out with us every month, and you get to be involved in the shenanigans and putting this show together. I ask those guys for help in giving me ideas for future shows and for bringing me information that I might not know about things that I'm going to review, and they've been invaluable. And we also just have some thoughtful discussions in there. So check it out. Bob the Hun, another $5 super chat. Chuck Dixon's run on Punisher is the last big run before Garth Ennis. His run in the 90s was huge, but nobody talks about it anymore. I remember Punisher and Ghost Rider being the two big kind of darker street-level characters in the 90s. Nobody was really talking about Daredevil all that hard back then. That's not really until Bendis that he gets his mojo back popularity-wise, I think. But yeah, Punisher and Ghost Rider were both huge. But I didn't realize who was writing at that point. Robert Wild, I'm honestly shocked Cap dislikes the Bay Turtles movie more than the Venom movies, not gonna lie. That might change if I have to, after I have to watch that Carnage movie again. Yeah, that's fair. I wasn't sure about that order. You might be right. It's just, it's all kind of perspective, right? That 2014 Turtles movie was better than I expected, but was still really bad. And Venom was also better than I expected, but not what they should have made. And it's, I think in a lot of ways, it's still a better movie than 2014 Turtles. I think it kind of makes more sense than that movie, weirdly. They're strange things to try to compare. I certainly think it's funnier when it wants to be funny, but then that second movie isn't, to me. So yeah, I don't know. It looks like there's another super chat. Let me see if I can get to it. Or did I miss one? I saw... Oh, yep. Chewbacca's Lover, $5 super chat. I liked Superman Returns as a kid. Oh, wait, no. Did I read that? Even though nobody else did? Yeah. No, I read that. It just, the dollar amount went up some, but I seem to be missing... If you left a super chat and I haven't read it, would you just let me know real quick? And then I'm going to end things here in a second. I'm just going to refresh this. If I can. Thanks for your patience, folks. Missed the rest of the popsicle comment. Did I? Popsicle scene from 2004 Punisher was lifted from a 90s Punisher issue by Chuck Dixon. He mentions it on his podcast. It's line for line. I mean, I read that. Chuck Dixon's run on Punisher is the last big run on Punisher. I talked about that. Yeah, apparently I missed one somewhere. My apologies. If I will post about it later if somehow I don't I don't end up seeing it. Yeah, because we've had enough comments now that I can't see a lot of them toward the top anymore. Uh, yeah, I don't see any others. Okay. Did you mention Megamind, says Robert Wild? Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, I did talk about Megamind. Anyway, okay, so the poll, the winner on the Rewind producer poll, uh, the Rewind selection board, as it were, is, in fact, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which I started watching today for my first watch, and that will be fun to talk about. I have no idea where I land on the rating for that yet, and if some of my opinions about story might change as I'm going through it with a fine-tooth comb. So I'm excited to talk about that. That'll be a lot of fun, and I'm jumping around a little bit with MCU. I have not been doing those in order. I think I started kind of doing that early on, and lately I've been jumping around more. So I still haven't done Civil War. There's a lot of stuff I haven't talked about yet, even from Phase 2 and 3. Have I done all of 2? Maybe I have. Or Civil War in 2. It must be, right? I'm not sure where the phase breaks are. I'm terrible at that whole thing. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing, and that'll be next Monday. So give yourself another watch of that if you're so inclined and you have time, and we'll talk about it next week. Thank you guys so much watching live, for your support if you left super chats, and for just chatting with me, and for just listening if you did that. Thanks for watching after the fact, and you guys are great. This was a ton of fun. I hope you enjoyed it, and we almost got to 2 hours again. I'm Captain Logan, and I'll see you guys if you happen to make it tomorrow night for the Captain Logan show on Geekvolution on YouTube, and other stuff happening this week on Geekvolution. And then next Monday, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I was Captain Logan. I'll see you later. Bye, folks.